The millionaire disguised himself as a servant and went to meet the poor girl he was dating. But when she discovered the whole truth, the millionaire couldn't believe what she ended up doing to him. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. Alexander Matthews stood at the vast window of his corner office at Matthews Enterprises, his steel blue eyes fixed on the small park across the street. At 35, he had everything money could buy: a successful technology company valued at billions, a penthouse overlooking London's skyline, and a fleet of luxury cars. Yet something was missing, and that something walked through St. James Park every morning at precisely 8:15. He had first noticed her 3 weeks ago. Unlike the hurried masses rushing to their corporate jobs, she moved with an unhurried grace, often stopping to help elderly park-goers or to throw breadcrumbs to the pigeons. Her simple floral dresses and worn messenger bag spoke of modest means, but there was a dignity in her bearing that surpassed the polished executives who frequented his boardroom. "Mr. Matthews?" His assistant's voice interrupted his reverie. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. Alexander adjusted his bespoke suit and nodded, but his thoughts remained with the mysterious woman in the park. In the boardroom, as his executives droned on about quarterly projections and market expansions, he found himself sketching her profile on his notepad. The gentle curve of her smile, the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear. "And that concludes our financial overview," Richard Wellington, his CFO, announced. "Any questions, sir?" Alexander cleared his throat, quickly flipping his notepad closed. "No, carry on with the implementation. Send me the final reports by evening." The meeting dispersed, but Richard lingered behind. "Is everything all right, Alex? You seem distracted lately." "I'm fine," Alexander replied, gathering his papers, "just considering some new directions for the company." Back in his office, he resumed his vigil by the window, but she had long since passed through the park. His fingers drummed against the glass as an idea began to form. It was mad, completely unlike his usually calculated approach to life, but he couldn't shake it. That evening, after his staff had departed, Alexander visited a small construction supply store in East London. The shop owner barely glanced at him as he purchased work boots, worn jeans, and basic tools. At home, he studied YouTube videos about basic construction work, practicing the terminology and mannerisms. The next morning, instead of his usual chauffeur-driven commute, Alexander parked his least conspicuous car several blocks away. In the privacy of his car, he changed into his workman's clothes, deliberately scuffing the boots and adding dust to his jeans. The designer watch was replaced with a simple timepiece, his perfectly styled hair mussed to appear more casual. Walking into St. James Park at 8:00 a.m., he felt oddly liberated. No one gave him a second glance. No recognition, no deference, no careful watching of their words. He selected a bench with a clear view of the main path and pulled out a newspaper, occasionally making show of checking his phone as if waiting for work instructions. At precisely 8:15 she appeared. From this close vantage point, he could see the small details he'd missed from his office: the warm brown of her eyes, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the small butterfly pendant at her throat. She carried a paper bag from what appeared to be a cafe, and the scent of fresh coffee followed in her wake. To his surprise, she paused near his bench, seeming to hesitate. Then, with a kind smile that made his breath catch, she approached. "I've been sitting here for a while," she said, her voice carrying a slight northern accent. "Waiting for work." Alexander fumbled for a moment, his carefully rehearsed backstory momentarily forgotten in the warmth of her direct gaze. "Yes," he managed. "The contractor's running late." She nodded sympathetically. "That's rough. Would you like a coffee while you wait? The cafe I work at always gives me an extra for my break, but I really shouldn't have two." The paper cup she offered was from a small local establishment, the Daily Grind. The logo was faded, the cup simple, but to Alexander, it felt more precious than the artisanal brews he usually consumed. "That's very kind of you," he said, accepting the cup. "I'm James, by the way." The false name felt strange on his tongue. "Emma," she replied. "Emma Turner. I work at the cafe just around the corner, and I'm usually walking through around this time if you ever need another coffee rescue." With a small wave, she continued on her way, leaving Alexander to stare at the cup in his hands. The coffee was simple, probably from a commercial machine, but as he sipped it, he thought it might be the best he'd ever tasted. What had started as a mad impulse now felt dangerous in an entirely different way. Emma Turner wasn't just a pretty face in the park anymore. She was real, kind, and completely unaware of the deception he'd just begun. As he watched her disappear around the corner, Alexander Matthews, titan of industry, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. His phone buzzed, his real phone, not the cheap model he'd bought for his disguise. The office would be expecting him soon. Standing up, he realized he'd stepped onto a path from which there might be no easy return. But as he recalled Emma's genuine smile, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The coffee cup, he decided, he would keep. Emma Turner's world was considerably smaller than Alexander Matthews', but no less complex. As she tied her apron behind the counter of the daily grind, her mind wandered to the construction worker in the park. There was something different about him. The way he held himself, perhaps, or the thoughtful look in his eyes as he'd accepted her coffee. Earth to Emma. Sarah, her co-worker, waved a hand in front of her face. The morning rush is about to start. The cafe was modest but beloved by locals, its mismatched furniture and chipped mugs lending it a homey charm that chain establishments couldn't replicate. Emma moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, warming pastries, checking coffee supplies, and greeting the regulars by name. Between customers, she packed delivery orders. The daily grind had started a corporate delivery service to survive recent economic downturns, and Emma had volunteered for the afternoon runs. The extra tips helped with her mother's medical bills, though lately something strange had been happening. Anonymous donations appearing in her mother's medical fund, always when things were most dire. "Large cappuccino for table 3, Sarah called out, interrupting Emma's thoughts. As she prepared the drink, she glanced at the clock, 10:30 a.m. She wondered if the construction worker, James, had found his work for the day. The morning passed in a blur of steam and coffee grounds. During her lunch break, Emma called the nursing service that helped care for her mother. "Any changes today?" "She's doing well," the nurse reported. "The new medication seems to be helping, thanks to that anonymous donor of yours." Emma felt the familiar mix of gratitude and unease. Still no idea who it might be. None? But whoever they are, they're making a real difference. After her shift ended at 2, Emma began her delivery rounds. The last stop was a modern office building she'd never visited before, Matthews Enterprises. The order was unusually large, 20 specialty coffees for some sort of board meeting. The security guard directed her to the top floor, where a harried-looking assistant met her at the elevator. "Oh, thank goodness," the woman said, helping Emma with the drink carriers. "They're running late, and Mr. Matthews always insists on decent coffee." Emma caught a glimpse of the boardroom through glass walls, men and women in expensive suits, laptops open, graphs projected on a screen. The CEO's chair was empty, she noticed, though a half-drawn sketch lay abandoned on the notepad before it. "Here." The assistant pressed a generous tip into her hand. "Thanks for the quick delivery." Back on the street, Emma checked her watch. She had just enough time to visit her mother before her evening shift began. The care facility was modest but clean, funded primarily by those mysterious donations. Her mother was awake when she arrived, sitting by the window with a book. "There's my girl," Catherine Turner smiled, her face tired but her eyes bright. "How was work today?" Emma settled into the chair beside her mother, describing her day, the morning rush, the deliveries, and, almost without meaning to, the construction worker in the park. "There was just something about him," she finished, slightly embarrassed by how much she'd said. Her mother's smile turned knowing. "Sometimes the heart sees what's invisible to the eye," she said, then changed the subject. "Did I tell you I used to work in that big technology company you delivered to today, Matthews Enterprises? Years ago, of course, before young Alexander Matthews took over from his father. What was it like?" "Different times," Catherine sighed. "Old Mr. Matthews was, well, let's just say his son seems to run things differently from what I hear. More modern, more corporate." She paused, lost in memory. "Though I always thought young Alexander had his father's eyes but his mother's heart. She was a kind woman." Emma glanced at her watch reluctantly. "I should go. My evening shift starts soon." "Go, go," her mother shooed her away. "And Emma, keep being kind to construction workers in the park. The world needs more of that." The evening shift was quieter, allowing Emma's mind to wander. She thought about James, wondering if he'd be in the park tomorrow. She thought about the mysterious donor helping her mother and about the empty chair in that corporate boardroom. Her worlds were separate: the cafe, the deliveries, her mother's care, the park. But lately she had the strange feeling they were beginning to overlap in ways she couldn't quite understand. As she wiped down tables that evening, she caught her reflection in the cafe window. Behind her, the streetlights of London were coming on, turning the city into a maze of golden dots. Somewhere out there, a construction worker named James might be thinking of their brief encounter. Somewhere, an anonymous donor was changing her family's life. And somewhere, in a glossy corporate office, a CEO's chair sat empty, while important meetings ran late. Emma shook her head at her fanciful thoughts. Tomorrow would be another day of coffee grounds and delivery runs, of hospital visits and park benches. But as she turned the cafe's sign to closed, she found herself looking forward to 8:15 a.m. with an anticipation she hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next 2 weeks, a ritual developed. Every morning Alexander arrived at the park dressed in his workman's clothes, and every morning Emma would pause by his bench with an extra coffee. Their conversations, initially brief, grew longer as comfort and familiarity blossomed between them. "You're always waiting for work here," Emma noted one morning, settling beside him on the bench. She had arrived earlier than usual, offering them a rare extended moment together. "Doesn't your contractor give you more stable assignments?" Alexander had prepared for such questions, but lying to Emma became increasingly difficult. "The work comes and goes," he replied, shifting slightly. "But I don't mind waiting here. The view makes up for it." He wasn't referring to the park, and Emma's blush suggested she understood his meaning. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture he'd grown to adore. "The cafe could always use help, you know, if you're interested in something more reliable." The offer, so genuine and thoughtful, made Alexander's chest tighten with guilt. Here he sat in borrowed working-class clothes, while his real wardrobe of bespoke suits hung in a closet, worth more than most people's annual salary. "That's very kind of you," he managed, "but I wouldn't want to impose." Emma shook her head. "It's not an imposition. Actually," she hesitated, then continued, "I've enjoyed our morning talks. You're different from most people I meet. You actually listen." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. If only she knew who she was really talking to, the CEO whose company she'd delivered coffee to, the anonymous donor helping with her mother's medical bills, the man who spent his afternoons in board meetings discussing million-pound deals. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other park regulars, an elderly couple Emma always greeted, a woman walking several dogs, a group of school children with their teacher. Alexander watched as Emma spoke with each of them, her natural warmth drawing people to her like moths to a flame. "You know everyone," he observed when she returned to the bench. "Not everyone," she smiled. "Just the morning crowd. They all have their stories, their reasons for being here. Like Mrs. Patterson over there, she walks here every morning because this is where she met her husband 60 years ago. And Mr. Chen with his newspaper. He's been reading on that same bench since his wife passed, says it helps him feel less alone." Alexander found himself viewing the park through new eyes. From his office window, these had been anonymous figures moving through the landscape. Now they were people with histories, with hearts, with daily rituals of their own. "What's your story?" Emma asked suddenly. "Why did you choose construction work?" The question caught him off guard. "I wanted to build things," he said carefully, choosing words that weren't entirely untrue. "To create something lasting, something that makes a difference in people's lives." "That's beautiful," Emma replied softly. "Most people would just say it pays the bills." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city awakening. Alexander noticed Emma checking her watch, and felt the familiar pang of knowing their time was drawing to a close. "I should go," she said, standing reluctantly. "The morning rush will be starting soon." "Emma," he called as she turned to leave, "thank you for the coffee, the company, everything." She smiled, that radiant smile that had first captured his attention. "Same time tomorrow?" "I'll be here." After she left, Alexander remained on the bench, his thoughts troubled. Each morning, the weight of his deception grew heavier. The man Emma was growing to know, James the construction worker, was more genuine than the Alexander Matthews who commanded boardrooms and signed contracts. With her, he could be himself, without the expectations and pretenses his position usually demanded. His phone buzzed, his real phone hidden in his jacket pocket. A message from Richard. Emergency board meeting at 9:30. Acquisition proposal needs immediate attention. Standing up, Alexander felt the familiar transformation begin. In 30 minutes, he would be back in his penthouse, switching worn jeans for an immaculate suit, replacing work boots with Italian leather shoes. The calluses he'd deliberately cultivated would be hidden beneath manicured nails, the carefully cultivated stubble smoothed away. But as he made his way out of the park, he realized something had changed. For the first time in his career, the prospect of returning to his corporate world felt less like a homecoming and more like donning another disguise entirely. In his car, changing back into Alexander Matthews, CEO, he made a decision. The anonymous donations to Catherine Turner's medical fund had been generous but impersonal. It was time to do more. He pulled out his phone and dialed Richard. "About that emergency meeting," he said. "I want to discuss some changes to our employee health benefits package, and I need a comprehensive review of all our former employees' pension plans, particularly from the previous administration." "That's unexpected," Richard replied cautiously. "Any particular reason?" Alexander thought of Emma's mother, of Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Chen, of all the people whose stories he'd never bothered to learn before. "Let's just say I'm seeing things from a different perspective lately." As he drove to his penthouse, the morning's coffee cup still sat in his car's holder, a simple paper cup from the daily grind, carrying the lingering warmth of Emma's kindness. Tomorrow he knew he would be back on that park bench, caught between two worlds, learning that sometimes the greatest fortunes can't buy what matters most. Emma noticed the changes in the daily grind's regular corporate delivery orders first. Matthews Enterprises, which had previously ordered only for board meetings, now requested daily deliveries for their entire staff. More surprisingly, they specifically requested that she handle their account. "It's odd," she told Sarah as they prepared the large order. "They even asked for our small batch coffee options. Most corporate clients just want the standard brew." Sarah shrugged, counting cup sleeves. "Maybe someone important finally developed good taste. Speaking of taste," she gave Emma a knowing look. "How's your construction worker?" Emma felt her cheeks warm. "James isn't my construction worker. We just talk sometimes." "Sometimes meaning every morning for the past 2 weeks?" Sarah grinned. "You leave earlier and earlier for your park walk, you know." The observation was accurate, though Emma preferred not to examine her feelings too closely. There was something about James that pulled at her, a gentleness in his eyes that seemed at odds with his calloused hands, an intelligence in his conversation that spoke of deeper waters. The cafe door chimed, interrupting her thoughts. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit entered, looking somewhat out of place among the mismatched furniture and local artwork. "Welcome to the Daily Grind," Emma greeted him. The man consulted his phone. "Emma Turner, I'm Richard Wellington, CFO of Matthews Enterprises." He extended his hand. "We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Emma shook his hand uncertainly. "I just handle your deliveries." "Actually, it's about more than that. We're considering opening an in-house cafe for our employees, and your name came highly recommended. Would you be interested in consulting on the project? Of course, you'd be compensated for your time." The offer was unexpected and somewhat overwhelming. I'd need to think about it. My schedule is quite full with deliveries and caring for my mother." Richard's expression softened. "We understand your situation, Miss Turner. The position would include full benefits, including comprehensive family health coverage." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Health coverage would mean no more depending on mysterious donations, no more lying awake wondering how to pay next month's medical bills. "Could I let you know tomorrow?" she asked. "Of course." Richard handed her his card. "We're also reviewing our former employees' benefits. Your mother worked for us, didn't she? Catherine Turner." Emma nodded, surprised. "Years ago, before her illness." "Expect a call from our HR department. There may have been some oversights in our previous management's retirement packages that we're working to correct." After Richard left, Emma sat heavily on one of the cafe's worn chairs. Sarah hurried over with a cup of tea. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked. "What did he want?" Emma explained the job offer, her mind whirling with possibilities. "It seems too good to be true," she finished. "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but maybe good things do happen sometimes. Speaking of which," she nodded toward the window. James was walking past the cafe, his tool belt slung over his shoulder. He glanced in, and their eyes met briefly before he quickly looked away and hurried past. "That's strange," Emma murmured. "He's never come this way before." The rest of her shift passed in a blur of activity. During her break, she visited her mother, sharing the news about Matthews Enterprises. "It's wonderful," Catherine exclaimed, though not entirely surprising. Young Alexander Matthews has been making quite a few changes lately, according to the news, implementing new employee welfare programs, reviewing old policies. Emma thought of Richard's visit, of the mysterious donations, of James's strange behavior outside the cafe. Something tugged at the edges of her awareness, like a pattern she couldn't quite discern. That evening, as she prepared for closing, a movement outside caught her attention. James stood across the street watching the cafe. When he saw her notice him, he seemed to struggle with himself before finally crossing the street and entering. The bell chimed softly. Emma's heart raced as he approached the counter, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "James? Is everything all right?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed strangely familiar. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you." But before he could continue, the door chimed again. Richard Wellington stood in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "Mr. Matthews," he said, "I didn't expect to find you here." Emma's world tilted sharply. She looked at James, no Alexander Matthews, as understanding crashed over her like a wave. The construction worker she'd been sharing coffee with, the CEO whose company was offering her a position, the mysterious donor who'd been helping with her mother's medical bills, they were all the same person. The paper cup she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow sound that echoed in the sudden silence of the cafe. The silence in the daily grind stretched like a taut wire. Emma stared at the man she'd known as James, seeing him properly for the first time. The careful disguise she'd somehow missed now seemed painfully obvious. The deliberate roughness of his hands, the studied casualness of his posture, the expensive watch-tan line he'd tried to hide. "Emma, please let me explain." Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying none of the working-class accent he'd affected in their morning conversations. "Explain what?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How you've been lying to me for weeks, how you've been playing some sort of game." She turned to Richard, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "And you knew? Was this all some elaborate setup for your business proposition?" Richard raised his hands defensively. "I had no idea about this, Mr. Matthews has been making changes in the company, yes, but I didn't know about your personal connection." "Personal connection?" Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean his elaborate deception? Tell me, Mr. Matthews, did you enjoy slumming it with the common folk? Was it entertaining to watch me share my extra coffee, thinking I was helping someone in need?" Alexander's face twisted with pain. "It wasn't like that. Emma, everything I felt, everything we shared, was based on a lie." She moved from behind the counter, needing the physical barrier between them removed so she could face him properly. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I told you things, personal things. I offered to help you find work. I worried about you sitting there every morning, waiting for jobs that were never going to come. I never meant to humiliate you," Alexander protested. I wanted to know you without all the complications that come with who I am. The person you know. That's the real me, Emma. More real than the CEO in the corner office. The real you." Emma's voice rose slightly. "The real you sits in that corner office making million-pound decisions. The real you has been anonymously paying my mother's medical bills, hasn't he? Was that part of your entertainment too?" Alexander blanched. "How did you— It's obvious now, isn't it? All of it. The mysterious donations, the sudden interest from Matthews Enterprises in our cafe, the changes in your company's policies. Did you think you were being noble, playing the secret benefactor?" Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should leave—" "No," Emma cut him off. "You can stay. After all, I should give you my answer about the business proposition." She turned back to Alexander. "I won't be accepting any positions at Matthews Enterprises. I won't be accepting anything from you. Emma, please." Alexander stepped closer, his expensive cologne, another detail she'd missed, replacing the familiar scent of coffee and construction dust she'd grown accustomed to. "The job offer is legitimate. Your experience, your ideas about community and connection, That's exactly what our company needs. What you need, Emma replied, her voice cooling, is to leave. Both of you. The cafe is closed. Richard headed for the door immediately, but Alexander lingered. I came here tonight to tell you the truth. Doesn't that count for something? Emma looked at him, really looked at him. The man before her was neither the rough construction worker she'd grown to care for, nor the polished CEO she'd glimpsed through glass walls. He was somewhere in between, and somehow that made it worse. You came to tell me because you were about to be caught, she said quietly. Richard's appearance just forced your hand sooner. Even your honesty is dishonest, Mr. Matthews. The formal address hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his hand falling to his side. I'll go. But Emma, please know that nothing about how I feel was a lie. The person you talked to in the park, that's who I want to be. Then I suggest you figure out who you really are, Emma replied, because right now I don't think even you know. After they left, Emma mechanically went through the motions of closing, wiping tables, counting the till, turning off lights. Her movements were steady, but her mind was chaos. Every morning conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of connection was being rewritten in her memory, tainted by the knowledge of deception. The paper cup still lay where she'd dropped it, coffee seeping into the worn wooden floor. Emma stared at it, remembering all the cups she'd shared with James, all the kindness she'd thought she was showing to someone in need. The irony of it made her throat tight. She picked up her phone to call her mother, then stopped. How could she explain this? How could she tell her mother that the mysterious benefactor and the construction worker she'd talked about were the same person, the CEO of the company where she used to work? Outside, London's evening lights blurred through the cafe windows. Tomorrow, she knew, she wouldn't walk through the park at 8:15. There would be no coffee to share, no gentle conversations on the bench. The ritual was broken, the illusion shattered. Emma finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her disappointment. It wasn't just the lies that hurt, it was the loss of something she'd thought was genuine in a world that often felt artificial. As she locked the cafe door, she wondered if anywhere in Alexander Matthews' web of deceptions there had been a thread of truth. The coffee cup still lay on the floor, its contents now a stain that would be impossible to completely remove. Rather fitting, Emma thought, for an evening that had left similar marks on her heart. Alexander Matthews sat in his penthouse office, staring at the newspaper spread before him without seeing it. A week had passed since the revelation at the Daily Grind, and Emma's absence from the park each morning left a void that his wealth and position couldn't fill. Richard entered without knocking, a privilege earned through years of friendship. The board is impressed with the new initiatives, he said, settling into a chair. Employee satisfaction is up, productivity has increased, and our public image has never been better. But you look terrible. Thank you for that assessment, Alexander replied dryly, finally looking up. Any other observations you'd care to share? Just one. Richard leaned forward. You're being an idiot. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You've implemented sweeping changes in this company. Better healthcare, improved pension plans, community outreach programs, all inspired by her. You're trying to be the man she thought you were, but you're doing it from up here in your ivory tower instead of actually talking to her. She made it clear she doesn't want to talk to me. So you're giving up. The Alexander Matthews I know doesn't give up. The Alexander Matthews you know is exactly the problem. Alexander stood, pacing to the window. Emma was right. I don't know who I really am anymore. Am I the CEO who makes decisions affecting thousands of lives? The man who sat on that park bench? Both? Neither? Richard watched his friend's reflection in the window. Maybe that's what you need to figure out before you try to explain anything to her. The words hit home. Alexander turned back to his desk, picking up a simple paper coffee cup, the last one Emma had given him. I've been running this company exactly as my father did, except for these recent changes. I've been living in his shadow, playing a role I thought I had to play. And now? Now I realize that the happiest I've been in years was sitting on a park bench in borrowed clothes, drinking coffee that probably cost less than the tissue paper in my gift bags. Alexander's laugh held a trace of wonder. I've spent my life building walls, corner offices, corporate hierarchies, social standing. Emma saw through all of it in a few minutes of genuine conversation. Richard nodded thoughtfully. So what are you going to do about it? Something either very wise or very foolish. Alexander reached for his phone. Cancel my meetings for the next few days, and get me everything you can find about small business development grants and community cafe initiatives. While Alexander worked late into the night, Emma was having her own revelation across town. She sat with her mother in the care facility, finally sharing the full story. Catherine listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When Emma finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Do you remember what I told you about young Alexander Matthews? That he had his father's eyes but his mother's heart? Mum, he lied to me, for weeks. Yes, he did, Catherine agreed. But why? Think about it, Emma. A man in his position could have approached you any time, used his wealth and influence to arrange a meeting. Instead, he chose to sit on a park bench every morning, drinking coffee that probably cost more in time than money for him, just to talk to you without his position getting in the way. Emma fidgeted with her apron strings. That doesn't excuse the deception. No, it doesn't, but it might explain it. Catherine reached for her daughter's hand. When I worked at Matthews Enterprises, old Mr. Matthews ran it like a kingdom. Cold, efficient, profitable, but without heart. His son was just a boy then, always watching, always listening. I remember thinking how lonely he looked in his perfect clothes, with his perfect manners. He's not a lonely boy anymore, Mum. He's a grown man who should know better than to play games with people's feelings. Perhaps. But consider this. When did Matthews Enterprises start changing its policies? When did they suddenly develop an interest in employee welfare and community outreach? When did Alexander Matthews start becoming the kind of CEO who cares about more than just profit margins? Emma was quiet, the implications of her mother's words sinking in. The changes had all started after their morning conversations began, after she'd shared her thoughts about community and connection, about treating people with kindness regardless of their position in life. The question you need to ask yourself, Catherine continued gently, is not whether he lied about who he was, but whether he was finally learning to be himself with you. Later that night, Emma walked past the Daily Grind's darkened windows. She'd avoided the park all week, taking a different route to work, but avoidance hadn't made her feelings any clearer. A movement caught her eye, a familiar figure standing across the street, not hiding this time. Alexander wore his business suit, but his posture held none of its usual corporate stiffness. Their eyes met through the evening gloom. Neither moved, the street between them feeling both too wide and not wide enough. Finally, Alexander stepped forward, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. Emma didn't move away. The evening air hung heavy with unspoken words as Emma and Alexander stood outside the Daily Grind. The street lamps cast long shadows between them, like the traces of lies and truths that had brought them to this moment. I've been working on something, Alexander said finally, breaking the silence. Would you be willing to see it? No deceptions this time. Just me. The real me. Emma studied him carefully. Gone was both the calculated polish of the CEO and the artificial roughness of the construction worker. Instead, she saw something new. Vulnerability, honesty, and a hint of the genuine warmth she'd first noticed in their park bench conversations. Why should I trust you? Because I'm not asking you to, he replied. I'm asking you to judge for yourself. No disguises, no pretenses. Just what I've been trying to build, inspired by you. After a long moment, Emma nodded. Show me. Alexander led her not to his corporate headquarters or some luxurious venue, but to a modest storefront several blocks away. The windows were covered with brown paper, but light leaked around the edges. He unlocked the door, stepping aside to let her enter first. The space inside took Emma's breath away. It was a cafe, but unlike any she'd seen before. Warm wooden tables, mismatched chairs carefully restored, local artwork on the walls, similar to the Daily Grind's charm but with subtle refinements. A teaching kitchen filled one corner, its equipment professional but not intimidating. Community bulletin boards lined another wall, already featuring notices about cooking classes and local events. What is this? Emma asked, running her hand along a countertop that reminded her of her own cafe's worn surfaces. A beginning, Alexander replied, maintaining a respectful distance. Or at least I hope it could be. It's a community cafe project, part of Matthews Enterprises' new community development initiative, but it's more than that. He guided her through the space, pointing out different areas. The teaching kitchen is for community classes, cooking skills for young people, nutrition workshops for families. The bulletin boards are for local announcements, job postings, community events. The cafe itself will operate on a sliding scale. People pay what they can afford. And Matthews Enterprises approved all this. Alexander's smile held a touch of his old confidence. I am Matthews Enterprises, but yes, the board approved it, especially when they saw the projected community impact and the positive press it would generate. Sometimes doing good can also be good business. Emma circled the space slowly, taking in the details. Everything showed careful thought. The height of the counters, the spacing of the tables, the comfortable seating areas designed to encourage conversation. It was the daily grind's warmth combined with resources and planning. Why? She asked finally, turning to face him. Because you showed me what a cafe could really be. Not just a place that serves coffee, but a place that builds community. Those mornings in the park, watching you greet everyone, remember their stories, care about their lives. It changed something in me. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as genuine nervousness. I've spent years making money, building a corporate empire, but you showed me how to build connections. Emma felt her carefully constructed walls wavering. And this is supposed to make up for the lies? No. Alexander shook his head. Nothing makes up for that. This isn't about making amends. It's about trying to be the person I discovered I wanted to be during those morning conversations. The person who cares about more than profit margins and stock prices. He moved to the counter, where a familiar paper cup sat. I kept every cup you gave me. Not because I was playing a game, but because they reminded me of real kindness. Not the manufactured kind we practice in corporate boardrooms. Emma picked up the cup, remembering those morning exchanges. You could have just talked to me normally, asked me out like a regular person. Would you have seen me? Really seen me? Or would you have seen the CEO, the wealth, the position? Alexander's voice was soft. I wanted you to know me without all that. I just went about it the wrong way. She set the cup down carefully. So what happens now? That depends on you, he replied. This cafe needs someone to run it, someone who understands both business and community. The position is yours if you want it, no strings attached. If you don't, I'll find someone else. Either way, the project continues. And us? Alexander met her gaze steadily. That also depends on you. I'd like to start over. Properly this time. No more lies, no more masks. Just me trying to figure out how to be both Alexander Matthews, CEO, and the person you knew in the park. Because both are real parts of who I am. Emma looked around the cafe again, seeing not just the physical space, but the possibility it represented. I'll need time, she said finally, to think about all of this. Take all the time you need. Alexander moved toward the door. The key is yours, whether you decide to take the position or not. Come back, look around, imagine the possibilities. Or don't, it's your choice, completely and truly yours. He paused at the doorway. For what it's worth, Emma, every conversation we had, every laugh we shared, every moment in the park, that was real. I just wish I'd had the courage to be honest about who I was from the start. After he left, Emma stood alone in the quiet cafe. The space hummed with potential, not just for business success, but for real community impact. Her fingers traced the smooth counter, the restored chairs, the carefully planned details that showed both corporate resources and genuine understanding of what made the daily grind special. The paper cup still sat on the counter, a bridge between two worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. Emma picked it up again, feeling its familiar weight, remembering countless morning conversations that had meant more than she'd realized, to both of them. The park looked different at sunrise. Emma stood by the familiar bench, watching early light paint the trees in shades of gold. She'd arrived an hour before her usual time, needing space to think without the weight of expectations, others or her own. A week had passed since Alexander had shown her the community cafe project. She'd returned several times, always alone, exploring the space and imagining possibilities. Each visit revealed new thoughtful details. A small library corner with books in multiple languages, a play area for children whose parents attended cooking classes, even a small garden space on the roof for growing herbs and teaching about sustainable food practices. I thought I might find you here, Emma turned to find her mother approaching, aided by her nurse. Catherine Turner looked stronger these days, benefiting from the improved care she now received, care that Emma could no longer pretend wasn't connected to Alexander Matthews. "How did you know?" Catherine smiled, settling onto the bench. "Because this is where stories begin and end and sometimes begin again." She patted the space beside her. "Sarah told me you've been visiting the new cafe space." Emma sat, watching the sun continue its slow rise. "I have. And it's everything a community cafe should be. Everything I've ever dreamed of creating, but never had the resources to accomplish." Emma picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "He thought of everything, Mum. Not just the big things, but all the small details that make a place feel like home." Catherine watched a family of ducks waddle past, heading for the park's small pond. "You know, when I worked at Matthews Enterprises, young Alexander used to sit in on board meetings with his father. He never spoke, just watched and listened. But sometimes, when his father made particularly harsh decisions, I'd see him wince. The boy had his mother's heart even then." "You keep saying that," Emma noted, "about his mother's heart. Margaret Matthews was a remarkable woman. She used to run a small bakery before she married into the Matthews family. She never lost that understanding of community, of how small kindnesses can change lives." Catherine turned to her daughter. "The morning after she passed, Alexander, just a teenager then, brought coffee to every employee in the building. Hundreds of cups, delivered personally. His father called it inappropriate, but we all understood." Emma absorbed this new piece of information, fitting it into the puzzle that was Alexander Matthews. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because sometimes people need time to grow into themselves, to find the courage to be who they really are instead of who they're expected to be." Catherine reached for her daughter's hand. "He lied about his identity, yes, but maybe he was finally telling the truth about his heart." The sun had fully risen now, painting the park in clear morning light. Emma thought about the community cafe, about Alexander's vision that somehow matched her own dreams perfectly. She thought about their conversations on this very bench, conversations that, despite the context of deception, had felt more genuine than any she'd had in years. "I'm scared, Mum," she admitted quietly, "not just of being hurt again, but of everything he's offering. It's such a huge opportunity, such a big change. Being scared means you're about to do something really brave." Catherine squeezed her hand. "Or very foolish. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference until after you've done it." Emma laughed softly. "That's not very helpful. Here's something that might be. In all the times you've told me about your conversations with James, you never once mentioned being attracted to his position or wealth. You talked about his kindness, his attention to others, his genuine interest in people's stories. Those things haven't changed, have they?" Before Emma could respond, movement near the park entrance caught her attention. Alexander stood there, in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, holding 2 paper cups from the daily grind. He hadn't seen them yet, and Emma recognized his expression. The same uncertainty she'd first noticed weeks ago when he sat here pretending to be someone else. Catherine followed her daughter's gaze. "Well," she said, struggling to her feet with her nurse's help, "I believe that's my cue to leave. Some conversations need to happen without mothers present." She kissed Emma's cheek. "Trust your heart, my dear. It's never steered you wrong before." As her mother departed, Emma watched Alexander debate with himself, clearly unsure whether to approach. In that moment of hesitation, she saw both the powerful CEO and the vulnerable man who'd sat beside her on countless mornings, and realized that perhaps they weren't as separate as she'd thought. Taking a deep breath, Emma stood and walked toward him. The morning light caught the steam rising from the coffee cups, creating tiny halos of mist that danced in the air between them. It was time for a new conversation to begin. The morning air crackled with possibility as Emma and Alexander stood facing each other in the park. Steam rose from the coffee cups in his hands, dancing in the early light like the unspoken words between them. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," Alexander said, offering her one of the cups. Emma accepted it, noting the familiar Daily Grind logo. "I wasn't sure either." She gestured to the bench, their bench. "Shall we?" They sat, maintaining a careful distance. The park was beginning to fill with its regular morning crowd, the elderly couple taking their constitutional, the woman with her dogs, the school children cutting through on their way to classes. Each person nodded or waved to Emma as they passed, and she returned their greetings automatically. "I've been thinking," Emma began, cradling her coffee cup, "about masks and truth, about who we pretend to be and who we really are." Alexander remained silent, giving her space to continue. "The thing is," she went on, "I realized I've been wearing my own kind of mask. The struggling cafe worker, the devoted daughter, the girl who gives away extra coffee to construction workers. I've been so focused on playing these roles that I sometimes forget to ask myself what I really want." "And what do you want, Emma?" She turned to face him fully. "I want to make a difference, not just in individual lives, but in the community. What you showed me at the new cafe space, that's exactly the kind of impact I've dreamed of having but never thought possible." "It's more than possible," Alexander replied. "It's already happening. The community response to the preliminary announcements has been overwhelming. We've had dozens of inquiries about the cooking classes, and local artists are practically fighting over the display space." Emma smiled despite herself. "You've been busy." "I learned from the best." His expression grew serious. "Emma, I know I went about everything wrong, but watching you at the daily grind, seeing how you built connections and created community, it showed me what was missing from my life, from my company. You didn't just serve coffee, you served hope, kindness, belonging. Those things can't be bought, you know, not even by Matthews Enterprises. I know they have to be built day by day, conversation by conversation." He gestured to the park around them. "Like you do here every morning." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the familiar sounds of the awakening park. Emma sipped her coffee, recognizing her own special blend, the one she created for quiet mornings when the cafe was just opening. "I've been visiting the new cafe space," she admitted, "almost every evening this week." Alexander's face brightened. And I have ideas. A lot of them." Emma set her cup down, turning to face him fully. "The teaching kitchen could partner with local schools for after-school programs. The bulletin boards could feature job listings from Matthews Enterprises and other local businesses. The sliding scale payment system could be balanced with corporate catering to maintain profitability while serving the community. Sounds like you've given it a lot of thought." "I have." Emma took a deep breath. "But if, and it's still a big if, I decide to take this on, we need to establish some ground rules." Alexander straightened, his full attention focused on her. "Name them." "First, this has to be my project. Your resources, your support, but my vision. No corporate interference in the day-to-day operations." "Agreed." "Second, we need to be completely honest with each other from now on. No more masks, no more games, no more hidden agendas." "Absolutely." "And third," Emma hesitated, then pressed on, "whatever happens between us personally needs to be separate from the business. If this connection we have doesn't work out, the cafe project continues. The community comes first." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Those are fair conditions. I have one of my own, if I may." Emma nodded, curious. "Give me a chance to show you who I really am. Not the CEO, not the construction worker, but the person who's trying to be worthy of both the morning conversations we shared and the responsibility I carry." The sincerity in his voice touched something in Emma's heart. She looked at the paper cup in her hands, thinking about all the cups they'd shared, all the conversations that had shaped both their lives in unexpected ways. "I think," she said slowly, "that person is already showing through." The morning sun had fully risen now, washing the park in clear light. Around them, the city was coming fully awake, traffic increasing, more people hurrying to work, the day beginning in earnest. But on their bench, time seemed to move differently. "So," Alexander ventured, "what happens next?" Emma stood, brushing off her skirt. "Next, I have to get to work. The daily grind's morning rush won't wait, even for life-changing decisions." She turned to him with a small smile. "But perhaps we could meet later, at the new cafe space. I have some design ideas I'd like to discuss." Alexander rose as well, hope lighting his features. "I'd like that." As Emma turned to leave, she paused. "Oh, and Alexander?" "Yes?" "Bring coffee, but this time make it yourself." His surprised laugh followed her down the path, and Emma found herself smiling. The morning felt different somehow, fresher, full of possibility. Change was coming, she knew, But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of it. After all, sometimes the best things in life start with a simple cup of coffee and the courage to be real. 3 months later, the community cafe was taking shape in ways neither Emma nor Alexander had fully imagined. The space had evolved beyond their initial plans, responding to community needs and suggestions with an organic grace that surprised them both. Emma stood in the teaching kitchen, watching a group of teenagers learn to make artisanal bread under the guidance of a local baker. The program had started as a simple cooking class, but had grown into a youth entrepreneurship initiative, with participants learning both culinary skills and business basics. "The dough needs time to rise," she heard the baker explain. "Just like good things in life, they can't be rushed." The words made her smile, thinking of her own journey over the past months. Her relationship with Alexander had developed slowly, deliberately, built on a foundation of honest conversations and shared dreams rather than masks or pretenses. "Something amusing?" Alexander's voice came from behind her. He'd taken to dropping by regularly, not as the CEO of Matthews Enterprises, but as someone genuinely invested in the project's success. "Just thinking about patience and timing," Emma replied, turning to face him. He wore a casual button-down shirt and slacks, his new normal when visiting the cafe. The perfect suits remained for board meetings, but here he'd found a middle ground that felt authentic. "Speaking of timing," he gestured toward his office across the street, visible through the cafe's windows, "the board is impressed with the quarterly results. The corporate catering division is exceeding projections, and the community programs are generating more positive press than our last 3 marketing campaigns combined." Emma nodded, proud but not surprised. "It turns out doing good can be good business after all." They moved through the cafe space together, stopping to chat with patrons and staff. The bulletin boards were filled with success stories, community members who'd found jobs, local artists who'd sold their first pieces, students who'd learned valuable skills. "Your mother's cooking class is still the most popular," Alexander noted, pointing to the waiting list for Catherine Turner's weekly baking sessions. Since her health had improved, she'd become a regular fixture at the cafe, sharing recipes and stories that brought different generations together. "She's in her element here," Emma agreed, "though she still won't share her secret scone recipe. Not even with you, Mr. CEO. Alexander laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and natural over the months. "Some secrets are worth keeping, I suppose." They reached the cafe's front counter, where Sarah, who'd eagerly joined Emma in the new venture, was training a new barista. The daily grind's influence was evident in the careful attention to customer service and community connection, but the space had developed its own unique character. "Remember," Sarah was saying, "every cup of coffee is an opportunity to make someone's day better." Emma caught Alexander's eye, sharing a knowing smile. How many cups of coffee had led them here? How many morning conversations had shaped this dream into reality? "I have something to show you," Alexander said, leading her to the rooftop garden. The space had flourished under the care of local gardening enthusiasts, becoming a green oasis above the city streets. Among the herbs and flowers, a familiar bench had been installed, an exact replica of their park bench but with a small plaque attached. "Where every story begins." Emma ran her hand along the wooden slats, emotion tightening her throat. "When did you do this?" "It was delivered this morning." Alexander sat down, patting the space beside him. "I thought we needed a place for our own morning conversations, even as we help create space for others to have theirs." Emma joined him, the evening sun warm on their faces. Below, they could hear the happy buzz of the cafe, students laughing in the teaching kitchen, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversations in multiple languages. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing to encompass not just the cafe, but everything their shared vision had created. "Honestly, no." Alexander took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers naturally, comfortably. "I imagined success in terms of profit margins and market share. You taught me to see it differently, in smiles, in connections, in community. And you taught me that dreams need resources to grow," Emma acknowledged. "That sometimes the biggest hearts can be found in corner offices, if you're willing to look." They sat together as the sun began to set, casting golden light across the rooftop garden. The bench beneath them was new, but felt familiar, like a story being retold in a different way. "So," Alexander squeezed her hand gently. What happens next? Emma smiled, remembering asking him the same question months ago in the park. Next, we keep building, keep growing, keep finding new ways to bring people together. Over coffee? Always over coffee. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the rightness of the moment. After all, the best connections start with a simple cup and an honest heart. Below them, the cafe continued its evening rhythm, a symphony of community and purpose they had created together. Different worlds had merged here: corporate resources and community spirit, affluence and accessibility, dreams and practicality, creating something neither of them could have achieved alone. And it all began with a morning walk in the park, a borrowed identity and the courage to be real. 1 year had passed since the community cafe opened its doors, and the transformation it had brought went far beyond its physical space. On this particular morning, Emma stood in the park where everything had begun, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The bench, their bench, had been preserved despite the park's recent renovations, a joint project between Matthews Enterprises and the local council to enhance the community space. Children now played in new playground equipment nearby, and garden boxes filled with herbs and flowers lined the walkways, tended by community volunteers. I thought I might find you here, Alexander's voice came from behind her. He carried 2 cups of coffee, one from the Daily Grind, one from their community cafe. Sarah said you left early today. Emma accepted the cup from their cafe, smiling at the familiar blend. I wanted to see the sunrise here, to remember. They sat together on the bench, shoulders touching comfortably. The morning routine of the park unfolded around them. The elderly couple who now taught Tai Chi classes at the cafe, the dog walker who'd started a pet therapy program, the school children who participated in their after-school cooking classes. Do you ever regret it? Alexander asked suddenly. Taking this chance? Building all of this? Emma considered the question seriously. The past year had been challenging, merging different worlds, balancing community needs with business realities, learning to trust not just Alexander but herself in a bigger role. Yet every challenge had brought its own rewards. No, she said finally, though I do sometimes miss the simplicity of those first morning conversations, when you were just James the construction worker, and I was just the cafe girl with an extra coffee. Alexander chuckled. We were never just anything, Emma. That's what I learned from you. Every person who walks through our doors has a story, dreams, potential. We just help create the space for those things to grow. Their cafe had become more than either of them had initially envisioned. Beyond the teaching kitchen and community programs, it had sparked a movement. Other businesses in the area had started adopting similar community-focused initiatives. Matthews Enterprises had launched a foundation to support small business owners with big dreams and bigger hearts. Catherine's Kitchen opens next month, Emma reminded him, referring to the second community cafe location named after her mother. Are you ready for another adventure? With you. Always. Alexander turned to face her fully. Which reminds me. He reached into his pocket, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. The small box he withdrew wasn't wrapped in expensive paper or adorned with designer labels. Instead, it was a simple brown paper bag, the kind they used for pastries at the Daily Grind. I had this whole elaborate plan, Alexander admitted, involving rooftop gardens and string quartets. But this morning, watching you here where everything began, I realized there's only one perfect way to do this. He opened the bag and pulled out a ring, not a massive diamond or flashy design, but a simple silver band with a small coffee bean pattern etched around it. Emma recognized it immediately as the one she'd admired months ago in a local artisan's window display. Emma Turner, Alexander's voice was soft but sure, you taught me that the greatest things in life aren't built on pretense or perfection, but on truth and genuine connection. You showed me how to be real, how to build something meaningful, how to see the extraordinary in ordinary moments. He held out the ring. Will you continue building this life with me? Not as CEO and cafe manager, not as James and Emma from the park bench, but as us, exactly who we are. Emma looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, the man who had learned to bridge 2 worlds, who had grown into himself while helping her grow into herself. In his eyes, she saw both the vulnerability of those first morning conversations and the strength of everything they'd built together. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the park. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of both their cafes coming to life. Coffee grinders whirring, morning greetings being exchanged, another day of possibilities beginning. Emma reached for the ring, her smile as warm as the morning sun. On one condition. Name it. We serve daily grind coffee at the wedding. Alexander laughed, sliding the ring onto her finger. I wouldn't have it any other way. Around them, the park filled with the morning crowd, each person carrying their own story, their own dreams. Emma and Alexander remained on their bench for a moment longer, holding hands, watching the world they'd helped create come alive with the new day. Some love stories are written in grand gestures and dramatic moments, but theirs had been written in coffee cups and honest conversations, in morning light and genuine hearts. And that, they both knew, made it perfectly real. The wedding was everything they hadn't planned, and perfect because of it. Instead of a grand hotel ballroom, they chose the rooftop garden of their community cafe. Instead of a celebrity chef's catering, they had food prepared by students from their cooking programs. And instead of expensive champagne, they served specially blended coffee from both the daily grind and their cafe. Catherine Turner, now fully recovered and running the cafe's most popular programs, had insisted on baking the wedding cake herself. She finally shared her secret scone recipe, not just with Emma and Alexander, but with all the young bakers in her training program. Some secrets, she declared, are meant to be shared. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Their vows, exchanged under an arbor of climbing roses, spoke not of fairy tale romance, but of real partnership, of building dreams together, of finding truth in unexpected places. Sarah, as maid of honor, cried more than the bride. Richard, as best man, surprised everyone with a heartfelt speech about watching his friend become his best self. But perhaps the most touching moment came during the reception, when Alexander revealed his wedding gift to Emma. He had created a scholarship fund in her name, providing opportunities for aspiring young entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses with social impact. The first recipient was a teenage girl from their cooking program who dreamed of opening a bakery that would employ people with disabilities. You see, Alexander told the gathered guests, the greatest change often starts with the smallest gesture. For us, it was a cup of coffee and a conversation. Who knows what other stories might begin with a simple act of kindness. As the evening wound down, Emma and Alexander found themselves back on their rooftop bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same colors that had welcomed their first honest morning together. I have something for you too, Emma said, pulling out an old paper coffee cup, the first one she'd ever given him. She'd saved it all this time, and now it held a small USB drive. What's this? Alexander asked, turning it over in his hands. The next chapter, Emma smiled. Plans for expanding our community programs nationwide. Different cities, different needs, but the same principle. Creating spaces where people can be real, where connections can grow, where dreams can take root. Alexander's eyes lit up as he reviewed the files on his phone. The plans were comprehensive, combining business acumen with community insight in a way that only they could achieve together. This is brilliant, he said finally. When did you have time to work on all this? During our morning coffee meetings, Emma teased. Some of us can multitask, you know. They sat together as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Below them, the last wedding guests were departing, but the warmth of the celebration lingered in the fairy lights strung across the garden, in the leftover cake being packed for the local shelter, in the coffee cups still scattered across tables. So, Alexander asked, echoing their familiar question, what happens next? Emma leaned against him, her wedding ring catching the light, the simple silver band that meant more than any diamond could. Next, we keep building, keep growing, keep finding new ways to make real connections in a world that often forgets their value. Together? Together? She smiled, remembering that first morning in the park, how far they'd come, how much further they had to go. After all, every good story needs a sequel. From somewhere below came the familiar sound of coffee beans being ground, the first preparations for tomorrow's opening. Life would go on, bringing new challenges, new opportunities, new cups of coffee to be shared. But now they faced it all as partners. Their different worlds merged into something stronger and more beautiful than either could have created alone. And so their story continued, not ending with happily ever after, but growing into happily right now, each day bringing new chances to be real, to build community, to share warmth one cup at a time. Because in the end, the greatest love stories aren't about perfect moments or grand gestures, but about two people choosing each other, choosing their shared vision, choosing to be authentically themselves. Every morning, as the sun rose over London, 2 cups of coffee would still be shared on a bench, sometimes in the park, sometimes on their rooftop garden. And in each cup, in each quiet moment together, their story lived on, a reminder that the most precious things in life often come disguised as ordinary moments, waiting for hearts brave enough to be real.